Uh, Hi, Allison.
Hi, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm okay.
So we're here to talk politics and some of the issues of the day. Why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll tell people who I am.
All right. I'm Allison Hoffman. I'm a senior writer at Tablet Magazine.
And I'm Michael Brendan Dougherty. People may know me from the American Conservative, and now I am politics editor at BusinessInsider.com, whose offices you can kind of see behind me.
This is not Tablet's offices that I'm sitting in. Tablet has much fancier offices, but I'm in Tablet South in Washington, D.C., so I should add that disclaimer.
So the big story for a week now basically has been Herman Cain and these allegations and his persistence in the polls. And yesterday the big development was Gloria Allred's press conference at the Friars Club here in New York, where she introduced a woman, Sharon Bialik, who made some very specific allegations that finally included the kind of salacious details that get the public talking. So I was wondering what you think of these charges and why maybe the previous allegations seem to have no effect on the polling, or very little effect on Herman Cain's polling, and maybe we could talk about whether we think this is actually going to derail his campaign.
Well, it's funny. I mean, Michelle Goldberg, who writes for Tablet, was in the Daily Beast today saying that, we have no real way of knowing, affidavits or not, whether these charges are true. But as she said, and I agree with her as a woman, it's totally believable. I mean, I certainly had something similar happen when I was just starting out in my first job, and not similar to the extent, but everybody, I don't know, and many women who haven't been hit on at one point or another by somebody older and who's in a position of being a mentor. So it's certainly believable at the very least, and raises questions. But I have to say, for me, the thing that it really reminded me most of was the Arnold Schwarzenegger accusations that came out when he was running for governor the first time in 2003. I happened to be at the LA Times then, and it was a similar situation where there had been allegations swirling for years, and there were two women who had been named previously, but years before, in the press, and they were still on the record. I mean, they couldn't take themselves off the record, but there were just dozens of other accusations that people weren't willing to make with their names on them. And here you have a situation where, you had these settlements, so clearly there was some kind of action that had been taken. And it wasn't just people talking, but it really did remind me of that campaign. In that case, obviously, the LA Times came out with the accusations right before the election, because there was many weeks of trying to get people on the record, and it was sort of a do or die. I mean, the election was around the corner, and it was a question of whether the paper was doing, whether the responsibility of the paper was to put things out there as best we had them before the election, or to wait, given how close it was and how likely it was to throw the actual race. But I think at the time it certainly had no effect on Schwarzenegger, either then or in his subsequent years in the governorship. So it's entirely possible that that Cain could, if he handles it right, come out of this okay. I mean, obviously his fundraising hasn't suffered, and he's got a lot of fans, right?
Yeah, it's odd. I mean, I thought when Politico first broke the story that there were two settlements in the 90s, I thought Cain's campaign was over. I thought that by the middle of Monday he would lose his Herman Cainness, so to speak. He would lose
Monday a week ago, not yesterday.
Yeah,
a week ago.
Yeah, Monday a week ago. That he would. What made Herman Cain appealing, I thought, was his unpolitician-like quality. That he didn't give press conferences where he's finally parsing words and charges and counter-charges. And I thought this would immediately send him into that mode that all prominent men go into when they're in, a crisis management situation. But instead, by the middle of the day, he was singing a hymn on C-SPAN 3. And, his fundraising went through the roof. So then I was waiting, okay, well, once salacious details come out, that when you have a public sex scandal, there has to be like a dress or a Coke can or some prop or some action. And so we got that. And now finally, I'm beginning to question whether that will derail him because, as my editor, Henry Blodgett, said, this seems to be a sex scandal with no sex, no inappropriate
Well, but
sex.
ask Anthony Weiner how that felt, right? I mean, he had even less sex, arguably.
Right, no, that's true. That's true. But, I mean, I've heard debates in my office saying, like, well, couldn't he just say that he made a pass at this woman and she rejected him, and he made passes at other women who have rejected him, and nothing's happened? I mean, as a moral question, this is a pattern that seems pretty disturbing for a married man. But I don't know. I mean, with the Anthony Weiner story, there was no sex, but there was like pictures, and he couldn't dispute the details of what happened.
That's right.
Because it sort of just happened in public. So I don't know. I mean, some people are speculating.
For me, sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, some people are speculating about, do conservatives even believe in sexual harassment? And I don't know. What do you think of that charge? Or
well, I wonder what you think of that charge. I mean, do you believe in sexual harassment? I assume yes, but maybe not.
Yeah, I do. I mean, it seems obvious to me, especially in what was alleged yesterday, which was, it seemed like a quid pro quo. A quid pro quo was described where, he reaches and grabs for her, and then when she resists, he says, "You want a job, right?" I mean, that's what's being alleged. I mean, that's clearly like what people consider old school style sexual harassment. That's even more serious and offensive than, say, the hostile work environment charge or other charges. I do question, I'm only in the skeptical side of that dialogue about what is sexual harassment, in that it's obvious that there are lots of workplace relationships that develop between superiors and subordinates. It's obvious that the workplace can be sometimes an erotically charged environment, sometimes precisely because of the subordinate-superior relationship. And I think it's extremely difficult to codify that both in corporate rules language and in the law. Clearly things that should be illegal, clearly there are things that should be illegal, like what was alleged yesterday. But I do think it's complicated, and that's why we find it endlessly fascinating to talk about.
Also everybody loves salacious detail, as you said it right up front. I mean, that's the truth is that everybody loves to talk about it because it's scandalous and it's interesting and everything else, But the interesting thing for me is I think it raises questions just about judgment, but what people do when they're in power and how much it goes to their head and what, it's the leadership issue for me much more than the moral issue, although certainly the fact that Mrs. Cain has been totally absent from the scene, and we certainly have not seen the good wife image of her standing by her man or any of it. But that really is between them. But the question, and this for me was an issue in the Weiner case also, what happens to these usually guys, but certainly in some cases powerful women, but for the most part men, but what happens to them when they're in charge, and what do they think they can do, and what does that sort of reveal about the kinds of people that they are and the ways that they make decisions? And I think that's the more sort of long-term interesting thing for Cain as a candidate anyway, but that, we may not have enough time to see how that plays out before his candidacy either folds on itself or moves beyond this,
Yeah, I mean, my prediction, for how this will play out is that, they've already done quick surveys, and Republican women are more likely to believe these charges than men. And I think if you see a 4 or 5 or 6 point drop in the polls one week, that will be then recognized he's falling in the polls, and then his support will just collapse in on itself. I think his support only holds so long as it seems like he's competitive with Mitt Romney, and I do think he's partly a placeholder for an anti-Romney vote. So I think as soon as his candidacy is seen as unviable by other supporters, it'll collapse. But it does raise a lot of questions, and I find it interesting just on that the level of the conversation it inspires in workplaces or in our newsroom, about what constitutes a sexual assault. An unwanted advance is, an aggressive advance that's wanted, an assault that's just never reported. It really, I don't know, it's fascinating. And actually, it's weird, too, because it provides an occasion to talk about this and all the hypotheticals of it. And it allows, I think it allows people to begin setting boundaries and norms in their own workplace without talking about each other in a very uncomfortable way.
That's interesting because you're right. It does that in a way that the Wiener scandal certainly didn't open any of that up, because it was all so explicit and also recorded that, there was no hypothetical. It just was what it was. And, clearly most people are not sending those kinds of pictures on Twitter or Facebook. But you're right. Once you get into this fuzzy terrain, it's much easier to have some of these conversations that we seem to not find other ways to be able to have. It's interesting.
Yeah.
There's something, just to go back to this point that you raised a minute ago, so to the extent that Cain is the placeholder for the anti-Romney vote, where do those people now go? I think you have a theory.
Well, I've been on a loan. I used to be at the American Conservative, and I can't hide my opinions really. But I've been on this lone journalistic crusade to convince other conservatives that Jon Huntsman is one of them, in the sense that his record in Utah was really conservative, especially by the standards when judged against Rick Perry and Mitt Romney, and that he simply just doesn't have the temperament of a conservative movement person. So you can't imagine him going, and being the most fired up speaker at CPAC or, the Values Voters Conference. So he doesn't have that tribal connection with conservatives. But I think, they'd be well served by going for someone who, policy-wise, has shown an ability to create consensus around conservative policy goals and has had success with them in his own state. And you're seeing this morning, Eric Erickson of Red State wrote just a blistering attack on Mitt Romney and on the idea of settling for him, and then even concluded by saying, perhaps I should rethink my rejection of Jon Huntsman. And I thought that was stunning, and I feel like Erickson is like a perfect proxy for a lot of conservative activists. And, so now after having gone through Tim Pawlenty, Michelle Bachmann, Rick Perry, and Herman Cain, I can imagine a scenario where if Huntsman sells himself to them correctly, conservatives could resolve themselves to voting for him to avoid
what do you think he would need to do? Because it seems like there's a pretty clear line between, connecting certainly Bachmann, Perry, Cain, but how do you flip that same sort of market voters over to Huntsman?
Well, the big thing I would say, if I was advising the Huntsman campaign, which I wish I was, I would say that Jon has to practice not speaking like a diplomat. So sometimes he'll say stuff like, we have to create an environment that speaks to job creation. And that kind of circumlocutus sentence just, it turns conservative brains off. Like, you want to say, we need to create jobs, and that's what I did in Utah as governor of Utah. And that's not what they're doing at the White House. So he needs to just speak clearly and directly to voters rather than speak gently to the kind of political class itself. And then also he needs to just sell his record as governor of Utah and not and stop engaging in like twittering about global warming or the parts where he is seen as a moderate. And I think it's valuable to be seen as a moderate in a general election. And I think it's valuable that whenever I explain to a liberal, like, all of the anti-abortion stuff that he signed into law in Utah or the pro-gun rights stuff, that their eyes just kind of glaze over and they say, yeah, but he seems like a really good guy. So, like, that's exactly the kind of candidate conservatives should want, is a guy that's got an extremely conservative record but seems unthreatening to the other half of the nation. So we'll see.
I wonder, since he's been sort of off the radar for the last couple of months, I wonder if that is something that he can hold on to. If he in fact really started a campaign to convince conservatives that he is conservative enough to win a primary, don't you think he'd start losing? Certainly I think to the extent that I think even liberals and moderates know. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at his record, and I think I'm in the camp that you just described. I think he seems like a perfectly nice guy. He served in the Obama administration. He's got these daughters. They're on Twitter. What's the problem? But if he actually started explaining his record, then I wonder if maybe his value on that side might start to drop.
I think it would. I think the nature of partisan politics is to always, I feel like a lot of liberals like Jon Huntsman now as a martyr to the conservative movement, right? So they say, like, oh, look how reasonable this guy is. This guy is like what the modern Republican Party should be, as long as conservatives
he's Bob Dole.
Right. As long as conservatives are attacking him, that's it. But once he became the nominee, it would be like, oh, look what he did on abortion and on taxes, and like he sold out to the Tea Party to win the nomination. So I think that would be the narrative then. But, you gin up those feelings during an election, but you don't actually believe them all the time, right? I know that conservatives, if Mitt Romney were the nominee, they would convince themselves that, like, okay, this is our champion during the election season. Just the way that a lot of liberals in 2004, I felt like, they'd wish that Dean or Gephardt or someone else had won. But when John Kerry won, they're like, okay, yes, he's a war hero and a war critic, which is also a hero, and we're behind him. But, secretly, you could see liberals in the back of their mind, they're thinking, like, this guy is a bazillionaire, like, this guy doesn't know how to speak to people in a way that's appealing. So you could see the doubts creep in. So, I don't know, there just seems to be a set of illusions that take hold during a campaign.
Do you think, we've seen this play out on the Republican side for years, right? And, we say conservative, but now there's Tea Party conservative, there's fiscal conservative, there's values voter conservative. And do you think that in 2012 that the party can find somebody, whether it's Mitt Romney, whether it's Huntsman, whether it's Cain, whether it's some other candidate who, the mystery candidate who's still waiting in the wings, who, I think time is running out for that. But there's certainly people who seem to hope that somebody else might appear. But do you think that the party can bring itself to vote for one candidate? It feels like every cycle, the party comes closer to fracturing on these lines. But do you think that sort of delusive capability sort of overrides that again?
I don't know. The party always has basically united. I mean, there's been times where there's been less enthusiasm than others. George H.W. Bush's reelection in particular comes to mind, where you had a conservative challenger, Pat Buchanan, who did very well in New Hampshire, but you didn't see. There was just not a huge turnout in a lot of states, and then also Bill Clinton, because of his political style and positioning, was able to really, bite into what are now in many ways like the bread and butter states for Republicans. So I do worry, though, that the story will be, for Republicans, I think, not that I worry, I don't care if Mitt Romney gets in the White House or not, but the story is going to be that Mitt Romney had an incredible amount of trouble closing the deal with conservatives. And next spring, I think you'll see lots of stories about whether evangelical Christians can vote for a Mormon for president.
Right.
And just by raising the question in the media, I think that's going to raise the question in a lot of churches and small group meetings among conservatives. But I think Obama is going to do most of the job of uniting the Republican coalition, and I think whoever the Republican nominee will do the same way for the Democratic coalition, which seems a little bit under strain lately. There just seems to be a lot of disillusionment with Obama. I won't put it outright anger, but I hear from Obama voters like, "Oh, maybe I wish I voted for Clinton or someone that would have been tougher."
Oh, well, I mean, look, you see it, the fact that there are polls circulating, featuring Hillary Clinton as the potential candidate. I mean, you certainly see it. It's out there. The level of dysfunction. I mean, I feel like it's hard because everybody's upset, and everybody's angry in the country, and it's hard to know where people will direct the sort of more ephemeral, generalized frustration and how that plays out. I mean, the thing I'm interested in is whether people even turn out on both sides. I think that you're right. You've got disappointed Democrats who might throw up their hands and say, forget it. I voted last time. I was really excited about it. And this time, why bother? And you've got Republicans who, no matter who the candidate is, might, certainly evangelicals might say, I'm not. I just can't bring myself to go to the polls and get excited and work for a Mormon candidate. You have all kinds of possibilities on both sides. That could make it a very low turnout event, even though everyone's seemingly obsessed with politics these days.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, one thing that's interesting, I mean, maybe this is a pivot point, is there's kind of a news story breaking last night and this morning about Barack Obama and French President Sarkozy kind of griping about Bibi Netanyahu. And it was interesting because supposedly Sarkozy said something like, I hate Bibi Netanyahu, he's a liar, or I'm fed up with him, Bibi Netanyahu, he's a liar. And Obama replied, you're fed up with him, I deal with him every day. Now, to me, this is like a classic political gaffe where you tell a truth that is impolitic. And, some people say it's not all that far from what has been said publicly before, but I think that this matters, and I feel like it could matter in a state like Florida for Obama. I mean, what do you think?
I think it's hard to parse. I mean, I think this is no secret that there's no love lost, certainly between Obama and Netanyahu. I think, Sarkozy's, to the extent that Europe is trying to maneuver itself into being a player in what's left of the peace process, Sarkozy's feeling might shake things up a little bit there. Sarkozy actually being caught on a hot mic might sour things a little bit there, but I don't see, truthfully, how things could get worse between the White House and Netanyahu than they have been. I mean, they've certainly gotten better in the last 6 months than they were. I mean, the absolute nadir was last May when Bibi was in Washington for the AIPAC convention and for his speech to Congress. But things have at least sort of stabilized. I don't know that voters in Florida, particularly Jewish voters in Florida, are so enamored of Netanyahu themselves that they would mind so much. I think that Bibi is one of these funny figures, at least in the American Jewish mindset, where you don't have to love him to necessarily think that you may not love him, but you might think that he's the right person for the job. In any event, we don't have a say, so he's there. But the thing that I thought was interesting about it was the extent to which it actually got attention, but it was somehow less of a big deal than I think it would have been 6 months ago, when there was really a sense that these men needed to find or could find a way to work together, and that something real on the ground might come out of that one way or the other, and that if they didn't like each other, or if they were embarrassed in public, that would have real consequences in the real world. And I think now at this point, the peace process is in such disarray that it hardly matters on one level, and in a way, maybe it's sort of a relief. I mean, one thing I think a lot of people have been looking for, certainly in Israel and on the Palestinian side, is some kind of catharsis. And I, people I talk to constantly are saying that, they're reaching for all kinds of things. I mean, even to the extent that people shrug and say, maybe a war would be good for us because we could actually work some of this out. I mean, it's remarkable the degree of frustration that people have with just the complete impasse. So to that extent, maybe everybody should just be more honest, and it sort of goes back to the Jon Huntsman point. Why talk in diplomatic terms when you can just say, what, I don't like you, but maybe I'll find a way to work with you. Maybe that's actually some new approach that could get us past some of this. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and whether at this point any of these men are so thin-skinned that it sticks. And of course, Netanyahu has the advantage of not, from everything that I understand, it not being at any risk of facing an election next year, so he can sit in the catbird seat and wait and watch whether these two men survive their elections.
Right.
So he's actually in a good place, and he doesn't have to respond. But
I mean, you talk about how Jews and Palestinians have this sort of desire for catharsis and sort of maybe telling it to each other straight, or pointing rockets and guns at each other to kind of work out these feelings. But what is the American Jewish feeling about this? Is it obviously it wouldn't be the same level of frustration, but is it frustration? Is it easier in a way to be? I've always been fascinated by. George Orwell talked about transferred nationalism, and how, and I've always thought this applied to Christian Zionists, where Christian Zionists can be much more nationalistic about Israel precisely because they're not there, and they're not familiar with Israel's faults, and that people in Israel live with day to day, and so they can kind of project onto it this perfect, almost like crusader state status. But do American Jews who, follow very closely political developments in Israel, do they feel just as frustrated, or do they have like an easier time just sort of promoting a policy that maybe seems more aggressive? What do you say?
Well, I think, there's something that you said needs to be picked apart. I mean, there are American Jews who spend a lot of time closely following Israel, and there are American Jews who really don't. So there, right away, you've got two different groups who sort of nominally have this shared interest, but it actually points off in different directions. I think that, you see it. There are plenty of American Jews who sort of know that something is going on, but don't follow it closely enough to, I hear all the time people say, I don't follow it closely enough, so I really can't say what my opinion is, because there's so many people who know so much more than I do, and nevertheless you have people who don't follow it that closely and are very susceptible to political attacks against this administration, but that's been true. It's not just the Obama White House that's gone through that. That was true for George Bush, the first George Bush, where there was a whole universe of people who got very riled up in the early '90s about the loan guarantees to Israel. So that's not entirely a new phenomenon, but I do think that in the same way that there are people, domestically, voters who are disappointed that all of the sort of hopes and dreams of 2008 have come to nothing, that there are Jews who are exhausted here also, and the Israelis certainly are exhausted, and Palestinians are really exhausted. And I think that, it's interesting, I've been watching some of the Occupy Wall Street debate about how deeply to get into, obviously there have been all the accusations of anti-Semitism in Occupy Wall Street, some of it to do with sort of images of Jewish bankers, but there's been this sort of thread coming now about a solidarity movement basically coming out of Occupy Wall Street and sort of signing on to the Palestinian cause in the Middle East. And it's mystifying to me only because it seems like there are so many pressing things to deal with domestically and in the domestic economy, which is why the movement started in the first place. But I think that same thread, you see in the Jewish community that there are people who say, look, you know what, it was fine to worry about it, but you people need to worry about it yourselves because we actually need to figure out our own home front. It's interesting, there was a big meeting over the weekend of the Jewish Federations, which is sort of the big communal, charitable and community group organization of the Jewish community, and they're looking at changing their funding patterns and changing the way that American Jewish money gets sent to Israel. And part of the reason for that is a demand on the part of individual city communities to have more control over whether the money goes to Israel, whether it stays at home, whether to fund, after-school programs and senior citizens programs in their own communities. And somebody said something to the effect that, the most Zionist thing, I think it was in the Jerusalem Post, that the most Zionist thing that Israel could do now is say, look, keep your money. We're good, and the Israeli economy is strong. They've had 60 years of people buying Israel bonds and investing there, and they now are really doing well. So it's an interesting sort of turnaround that way. So it's a funny moment where I think people have these habits of being worried about it and being concerned about it, but some of the underlying fundamentals of the relationship are changing as America starts to struggle a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I've been fascinated to kind of follow along with sort of the American Jewish conscience about Israel. The thing is, I don't know if it's going, in a way, it always just seems to be a live issue in the sense that, every few weeks it seems that there's a major magazine piece or online piece that's being talked about where, about younger American Jews not being as Zionist as their parents, or and so just there seems to be, I don't know what you would call it, but it's just like a constant soul searching, as if almost like soul searching about Zionism were itself like the greatest form of Zionism that exists. And also every other week there are, major magazine features about Israel's future, whether, as demographic changes continue apace in Israel and in the territories, whether a two-state solution is even still thinkable in another generation. So I don't see this dying down as an issue, even if a lot of American Jews don't feel as anxious about it in the next 20 years as they used to.
No, I think you're right. It's one of these questions that, if you ask somebody about it explicitly, they'll have all kinds of opinions about it. But if you observe people in their day-to-day lives and the way that they think about things or the things that they think about, where it ranks maybe is different. But, there's an endless market for that kind of soul-searching. And part of the reason for it is you have a community that's very attached to the idea of a community, but you have people who are far less religious and religiously sort of trained than their grandparents were, and people looking for a way to keep that community together. And for a long time, Israel and Zionism was it, and it was an easy way to do that. But now it still functions that way, and people, I think it's important, and I think that people really do care. It's not just a rhetorical idea. People really do care about Israel. They go. You've got a whole generation of 20 and 30-year-olds who now have been sent to Israel on these free birthright trips and really have a sense of having been there. There's a reason why those things got funded, and there's a reason why it was so successful. But I think that's the tension that's interesting. Is as people start to contend with the domestic issues that we have, whether when you talk about the American Jewish vote per se, how that starts to play out in something like this Obama gaffe. I mean, I can't imagine that people would be, that if the economy were excellent and people's houses were worth what they were 5 years ago, that people would be that concerned about the love lost between Bibi and Obama. I mean, that's one way of looking at it.
One thing that one thing I find a little odd, just like another side alley of this issue, is I'm a conservative who's been critical sometimes of the United States' alliance with Israel. Not that I object to it in principle, but just sort of the lopsidedness of it sometimes. And I'm surprised. It's actually, I think, remarkable that so many conservatives who get so exercised about foreign aid to Egypt or to Pakistan or anywhere else, that there's almost no reaction whatsoever when Obama says, kind of matter-of-factly, I deal with Bibi Netanyahu every single day. And that Israel is the number one recipient of foreign aid, and a lot of that is through military channels. In some ways, of course, it's a welcome development because it means that there isn't, that there's functionally little or no anti-Semitism on the right. But it certainly is weird for a right that prides itself on this kind of jealous nationalism. That the same constituents also seem to look at our close alliance with Israel as totally normal and to be expected. That's like an amazing intellectual development in the last 70 years. I mean, I actually think it's not remarked upon enough how strange that is.
Well, I mean, I wonder, I'm not entirely sure that I totally agree that there's no anti-Semitism on the right. And I wonder, I know it's an active concern always, in the Jewish community about whether, there's not the strain in the Christian Zionist world that says,
right.
Yes, and the very end of this is actually that, you all convert.
There
is that. Look, there was a paper that came out last week from two very senior, sort of former, a pair of very senior advisors from both the Bush and the Clinton administrations, saying, look, it's a value to us. It's not just philosophical, but having Israel in the Middle East as an ally. And this is certainly an argument that the Netanyahu government makes all the time, that that they are the reliable ally, that they are particularly as we're pulling out of Iraq, that they are the people who will always let us launch airplanes and always cooperate and always be on our side. So there is that very pragmatic, functional argument that gets made that has very little connection, but draws on probably the kind of more abstract connection. But you're right. You saw it in that last Republican presidential debate, where in the midst of a conversation about foreign aid, and I think it was Ron Paul who really sort of flagged the issue, and he said, "Well, wait, you can't have it both ways." And everybody said, "Sure, we can. We are." But you're right. It is an interesting thing, and there's certainly I certainly have heard people in the last year sort of raise the point a little bit differently, which is to say that they've asked, well, how is it that the Christian community and the evangelical community is so sort of unswervingly pro-Israel, and Jews are so worked up about it and so confused about it? So there is that oddness in it, and whether it's what you said earlier, that Jews are more familiar with it and more familiar with the sort of nuances of history and of reality, and whether that explains all of it, I don't know. But to pivot from this actually into this other question, I mean, there is now a whole other issue, which is the sort of strangeness of how this White House and previous White Houses are handling the question of Israel. I mean, you've got this sort of unshakable support on one side, and then there's this persistent refusal to, in this particular case, list Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And we've heard for years the debate about moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Of course, most countries have their embassies in Tel Aviv, and the U.S. embassy is a block from the beach, so I can't imagine that the staff there are particularly eager to give up that space. But this is an issue, and actually yesterday I was at the Supreme Court. There was a hearing in a case that's been working its way through the courts since 2003. And it's an interesting case. Basically, the substance of it is that there was tucked away into the 2002 Foreign Aid Appropriations Act a sub-clause. One piece of it was encouraging the executive branch to, get started on moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and that's something that has been cooking for a long time. But the thing that was new that year was an explicit direction to have the State Department allow American citizens who were born in Jerusalem, so this is primarily children of American citizens who are living there, list Israel as their place of birth. The way that it's set up now is that if you're an American citizen and you're born in Jerusalem, you put down Jerusalem. If you're born in Tel Aviv and you're born in Haifa, you put down Israel. And it doesn't matter where in Jerusalem you're born, whether it's West Jerusalem and parts of the city that are, if you're born in the Prime Minister's office, in fact, you would still need to put down Jerusalem and not Israel. So Congress said that was ridiculous, and that those 50,000 American citizens should be allowed the option that they should either be able to put Jerusalem or Israel, and that on the face of it is in line with a policy that allows people who are born in Haifa or in Tel Aviv to actually not put Israel. If they would like to just put the city, they can, and you imagine that's mostly Arabs, but it's, it could be anybody who was born in those cities. So anyway, that happened. President Bush signed this in 2002 and actually issued a signing statement saying that he saw it and appreciated Congress's consideration of the matter, but that it was not something that they had any business ordering him to do, and that he was going to take it as advisory, and that he was therefore going to simply ignore their advice. So the result of that was this lawsuit on behalf of a now 9-year-old boy who was born a few weeks actually after this bill was signed. And so this came to the Supreme Court yesterday, and the real question is, it's a separation of powers question. It's whether Congress has the authority or the ability to direct the executive branch, specifically the president or the State Department, when it comes to deciding whether Jerusalem is the capital of Israel is actually not the question, but deciding whether Jerusalem is in Israel at all is the question that's here. So it's an even more, on the face of it, absurd question because, I think nobody can imagine a peace agreement in which some piece of Jerusalem was not in Israeli hands. But this came up to the Supreme Court yesterday, and it's interesting, one, because the original case was filed against the Secretary of State, and now with Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State, the name of the case has shifted, so it actually is this boy, Menachem Zivotofsky, versus Hillary Clinton. So it's actually taken on a partisan cast that it really didn't have to begin with. But here, you have the White House and the State Department, the executive branch, arguing essentially that no, they do not want to say that Jerusalem is in Israel, and there's been a whole series of stories looking at the fact that they've actually, in advance of this case hitting the Supreme Court, have gone through and scrubbed photographs that are on the White House Flickr feed to take off Jerusalem, Israel. So there's clearly an awareness of this at the same time that you have, as you pointed out, all of these, deep military commitments, all of the, endless statements about the unshakable relationship. And so it's an interesting question. And the thing that came up in the court hearing that was really fascinating was a question, one from Justice Scalia and one from Justice Sotomayor, both sort of pointing at the same issue, which is what if, they didn't say Palestine, but they said, what if there's a breakaway state that wants recognition, and one way or the other, it's an act of war. They say it will be an act of war if the U.S. refuses or does recognize them, and if Congress and the president disagree about whether to recognize this state, who wins? And given everything that's happened with the Palestinian effort to win statehood at the United Nations, it's not an entirely abstract
Right.
question.
Right.
So you start to see, and the government's position, starting with this silly passport question of is Jerusalem in Israel, the government's position ultimately was it's the president. So that raises all kinds of interesting questions about Congress's power and about who. I mean, I think everybody understands that Congress would be hard pressed to recognize the Palestinian state. They're looking at taking away funding from the Palestinians, just for going to ask for a state. So that it really sort of shed a whole new light on how some of these questions play out, and they play out one way when you've got Obama and Sarkozy talking, and Obama and Bibi talking, and another way when you actually look at the mechanics of it.
Yeah, no, to me, it's really fascinating, not just, on the constitutional issue of who has authority here, but also I was referring earlier to Christian Zionists and other groups in the United States who, are constantly, that's one of their big issues, when you go to a Christian Zionist conference, moving the embassy to Jerusalem to me, it's interesting because I think it's not only a statement about what Christian Zionists want to say about Palestinian ambitions for a statehood, but it also seems to be implicitly a kind of push from Christian Zionists to redefine Israel itself and to say that, in a sense, Jerusalem is the spiritual capital of Israel, and that's more important than Tel Aviv, which is sort of the living embodiment of a modern Jewish state, right? I mean, so
that's where it started,
Yeah, and so to me, it's like I would feel like if I was an Israeli or if I was Jewish, I would actually find this a little offensive. I mean, not only is it maybe dangerous and sensitive on a diplomatic end, but it also seems like an implicit critique. I mean, it would be like I can't think of an analogous American situation, but Washington, D.C. is our political capital, although it wasn't always such. And, we have a country where our cultural capital may be Los Angeles as far as the movies we export. Our financial capital is in New York, and, maybe unofficially our intellectual capital is still Boston with its heritage of, everything from Brook Farm to all the universities. And so if someone else was suggesting where to put our capital based on what they wanted America to be, I would find that pretty offensive, even if it was tied up with other diplomatic considerations or constitutional ones. So, where do you see, we should wrap it up soon. Where do you see it going forward? If Obama won a second term, I mean, do you think that our diplomatic relation with Israel and with the peace process will just remain in the kind of a desperate holding pattern it's been in for some time? Or do you see, if Obama was reelected, that would be a chance to kind of reboot the relationship, as it were, just sort of in the recognition that, okay, we're stuck with Obama for 4 more years, and we still have to make progress.
Right. I mean, what that would mean would be a flip from the current setup where, Bibi has been the one with theoretically a 5-year mandate, who, the strategy has been, consciously or not, to wait it out. They waited and were, in 2010, were rewarded with a Republican House, which helped them. And, they can wait until January 2013 and see what happens. But if Obama is back at that point, then it's Bibi actually who's looking down the barrel of a potential election fight. The thing that, and in a sense that hasn't changed. I mean, the last Gaza war in late 2008 and early 2009, that came on the heels of a very last-minute push by Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration, as you know, to try and seal a peace deal, which they've been trying to do certainly aggressively for the last 4 years of that administration. So it was a second-term initiative that way. And then you had the switch and the Israelis deciding that they really needed to do something quickly while they still had Bush in the White House. So it's not entirely clear kind of what happens. One way to look at it is that it's so dysfunctional, and particularly on the Palestinian side, it's not clear what will happen there either. And I know that there are a lot of people who are concerned that time is running short just because of all kinds, not just because of the 2012 elections on our side coming up. And I think when people say time is running short, what they mean is we don't know what comes next. So if we want to reach some kind of a deal in the circumstances where we actually know all the players and know what the parameters are here, the time for that is running short. But there clearly will be something that is on the other side of it, and we just don't quite know what it will be or what it will look like. But the other unspoken issue here is Iran, and now there's been in the last week there's been a lot of noise out of the Israeli press about active considerations in the Israeli cabinet about making plans for actually going ahead with a strike against Iran and its nuclear installations, and so I start to think that actually might take precedence over the Palestinian issue between now and the election here, if only because that has very real consequences beyond Israel for the rest of the world, but also it actually is something that could be resolved in a way that the peace issue may not.
Right. Wow.
So so the debate actually goes that direction. You saw it even in the stories this morning about the Obama-Sarkozy meeting. That actually was a much more sort of keen concern. Is if these two men are responsible for either slowing the Israelis down or figuring out how to work with the Israelis against Tehran, and that actually sort of brings back into focus the question of what their relationship is with each other. But again, I would suggest that it's no secret to the three of them that they don't get along. So, but that's sort of the next thing that I think will be on the horizon, actually.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, and as I said, I was saying before about how we have these endless magazine features, and it seems like we can expect a lot more as Bibi's time begins to shrink again. Just amazing. Well, listen, this has been really fascinating and great and pretty in-depth, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
You too. I'm glad we were able to make the time, and look forward to talking again next time.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much, and have a good day.
All right, you too. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye.